It was supposed to be just another quiet morning. The kind where the air is crisp, the birds are chirping, and the steady trickle of water from my backyard creek fills the silence like nature's own soundtrack. That little creek had been there for generations, cutting gently through the edge of my property. It was more than water, it was a part of the land's soul. But that morning the sound was wrong. It wasn't the soft gurgle I was used to hearing. It was muffled, almost like someone had put a pillow over nature's mouth. I stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, expecting maybe a branch had fallen or some leaves had clogged the flow. But then I saw it. My heart froze. The sparkling stream I had loved since the day I moved here was gone. In its place was a long, gray, ugly scar running down the middle, wet cement. Fresh, thick, still glistening in the early sun. And it stretched from one end of my property to the other. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the sharp smell hit me next. The unmistakable sting of concrete powder mixed with water. My shoes sank slightly in the damp soil as I walked closer, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. This wasn't some small blockage. This was intentional. Someone had poured an obscene amount of cement into my creek. And not just any someone. I already had my suspicions. You see, my neighborhood has a very active HOA. And when I say active, I really mean controlling. They've always had an opinion about everything. What color you paint your house, how long your grass should be, even where you park your truck. And then there's her. The unofficial queen of the HOA. The one everyone calls Karen behind her back, though I'm not sure she'd mind because she practically wears it like a badge of honor. She had been complaining for months about my creek. Claimed it looked messy and attracted mosquitoes. Said it was a safety hazard for kids who might wander near. I thought it was ridiculous. Kids around here are too busy on their tablets to even notice a creek. The HOA had sent me polite notices at first. Then came the formal letters. I replied each time, explaining the creek was a natural waterway, part of the property long before any of these houses even existed. I told them altering it could be illegal without proper permits. I even sent them state guidelines about water rights. I thought I had shut the whole thing down. Apparently, I underestimated their determination, and her arrogance. Standing there looking at the drying cement, I felt a mixture of rage and disbelief. My mind raced through the possibilities. How did they do it without me noticing? My security cameras covered most of the backyard, but the creek runs near the tree line. Maybe they worked under cover of darkness. Or maybe they thought early morning would be safe while everyone else was still asleep. Whoever did it knew exactly where to pour so it would cut off the water flow completely. I crouched down and touched the edge of the hardened surface. The gray sludge clung to my fingers, gritty and cold. My creek, gone. Just like that. It was like someone had cut the heartbeat out of the land. The birds were quiet now, as if even they were stunned. The water, once lively and clear, was trapped somewhere upstream, forced to stop in its tracks. And that's when it hit me. Water doesn't just disappear. If it can't flow one way, it finds another. The thought sent a strange shiver down my spine. Where was all that water going now? It had to be backing up somewhere. And if this was done without a proper drainage plan, there could be consequences, big ones. Water has a way of finding weaknesses, slipping into cracks and seeping where it's not welcome. And in a neighborhood like ours, with basements built close to the water table, that could spell disaster. But at that moment all I could do was stand there, staring at the cement like it was some alien growth. My peaceful little creek silenced. My backyard wounded. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a storm of questions started brewing. Why would they think they could get away with this? Did they really believe I wouldn't notice? Or did they just not care? I took a deep breath, the smell of cement still stinging my nose. My coffee had gone cold in my hand, but I barely noticed. My focus was locked on that long gray line slicing through the earth, and the gnawing feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When I first bought this place, the creek was one of the main reasons I fell in love with it. It wasn't huge, but it had this calm, steady flow that made the whole backyard feel alive. In spring, it glittered in the sun as water ran clear over the pebbles. In summer, dragonflies skimmed its surface and wildflowers bloomed along the edges. In autumn, the water mirrored the fiery colors of the trees above. Even in winter, when most things went quiet, the creek whispered under a thin sheet of ice. It wasn't just beautiful, it was personal. That creek had been part of the land long before any of these houses or streets existed. According to old maps, it was fed by an underground spring that had been flowing for decades. Some of the older neighbors told me they used to play in it as kids, catching minnows with their hands. They remembered it as part of the neighborhood's charm, a piece of nature tucked between the rows of houses. But not everyone saw it that way. When I moved in, I quickly learned that our HOA likes everything to look a certain way. Lawns have to be trimmed to an exact length. Fences have to be painted only in approved colors. Even holiday decorations have strict guidelines. And then there was her. The woman who seemed to think she was the president of the entire neighborhood, even if she technically wasn't. You know the type, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for violations, like she's on some kind of patrol. From the day I moved in, she made it clear she didn't like the creek. The first time she mentioned it, she stood at the edge of my yard, pointing with her manicured finger. Have you thought about covering this up? Or at least putting in a culvert? It's a safety risk, she said in a tone that made it sound less like a question and more like an order. I told her no. Politely at first. I explained that the creek was part of the natural drainage for the whole area, and blocking it could cause problems. She didn't care. A few weeks later, I got my first notice from the HOA. They claimed the creek was unsightly and could attract pests. I sent them a written response, quoting environmental regulations and water rights laws. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The notices kept coming, each one worded more firmly than the last. At one point, they even tried to fine me for failure to maintain landscaping, which made no sense because the creek wasn't landscaping, it was a natural waterway. I refused to pay. That's when the conversations got tense. She cornered me at the mailbox one afternoon, smiling that tight smile people give when they're actually furious. Some of us are tired of looking at it, she said. We'll just have to take matters into our own hands. I brushed it off, thinking it was just empty talk. But looking back now, maybe that was the moment I should have realized she meant it. Over the next few months, I noticed her and a few other HOA members walking the property line more often. Sometimes they'd stand at the edge of the creek, pointing and whispering. Once I saw her taking photos. I still thought it was just petty HOA harassment. I had no idea they were planning something as extreme as dumping cement. The irony is, that creek didn't just benefit me, it actually helped keep the whole neighborhood's drainage in check. During heavy rains, it carried excess water away from low-lying yards. If anything, it prevented flooding. But to her, it was an eyesore that needed to be erased. What made it even stranger was the obsession. She didn't just casually dislike it, she seemed personally offended by its existence. Maybe it was because she couldn't control it, couldn't manicure it into the HOA's picture-perfect standards. Maybe it was about proving she could make changes whether I agreed or not. Whatever it was, she clearly decided she was going to win this battle. And now, standing there staring at the fresh cement, I could see her fingerprints all over it, figuratively if not literally. She had the motive. She had the history of complaints. And most importantly, she had that smug belief that rules didn't apply to her as long as she was the one making them. The creek was gone. But in my gut, I knew this wasn't just about water and rocks. This was about control. And in trying to take it from me, she might have just created a much bigger problem than she ever imagined. The more I stared at that gray line of cement, the more the anger began to bubble. This wasn't just petty HOA nonsense anymore. This was destruction of property. This was sabotage. My creek was part of my land, my home, my peace, and someone had decided they could just erase it overnight. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my phone and started walking the length of the creek, snapping photos from every angle. The cement wasn't just dumped in one spot, it was poured along the entire stretch that ran through my yard. Whoever did this had worked fast, but they'd also worked sloppily. There were footprints in the mud along the bank, some deep enough to show the tread pattern from their boots. I followed them. The prints led toward the narrow gap between my property and my neighbor's fence. From there, they disappeared into the manicured grass of the common area. I didn't need to see more to know where they'd come from. That common area was practically her headquarters. I marched back toward the house, still clutching my phone, and scrolled through the security camera app. My front and back cameras didn't cover the creek, but they did catch something. At 5:47 a.m., a pickup truck pulling a small trailer drove past my house and parked in the common area. Less than 30 minutes later, it drove away, lighter this time. The trailer looked familiar. I'd seen it before, parked in front of her house. It was small, beat up, with a dented fender and a strip of faded red paint along the side. My stomach twisted. She hadn't even tried to hide it. I called the HOA office. The woman who answered had that overly sweet, professional voice that instantly made my blood pressure spike. I explained what had happened, told her about the cement, the truck, the footprints. She barely reacted. "I'm not aware of any authorized work being done in your area," she said, like she was reading from a script. Authorized? I snapped. You think I authorized someone to fill my creek with cement? "I can make a note of your concern and pass it along to the board," she replied. I almost laughed. Pass it along to the board? The board is the one that did this. It was pointless. She wasn't going to help. So I did what any sane person would do. I went looking for proof. The next stop was my neighbor, Dan. He's lived here longer than I have and keeps an eye on the neighborhood from his front porch most mornings. Sure enough, when I knocked, he answered with his coffee mug in hand and a curious look. "You see anything weird this morning?" I asked. His eyebrows lifted. "Weird? You mean besides that truckload of concrete bags heading toward your yard at sunrise?" My heart sank. "You saw them?" "Sure did. Karen was with them. She was standing there pointing toward your creek while two guys in work gloves unloaded the bags. Didn't look friendly either." That was it. Proof. Witness. Timeline. My mind was already moving to the next step. But before I could even decide whether to call the police, something else caught my attention. By late afternoon, after the sun had baked the fresh cement for hours, I noticed something strange. The grass near the far end of my property was wetter than usual. I walked over and pressed my shoe into the ground. It squished under my weight. The water had started backing up. It was already seeping into the soil, pooling in little muddy pockets. I followed it toward the slope that led to the back of her property. Sure enough, the ground behind her house was soggy. And lower down, near the foundation, a thin trickle of water was running toward her basement window well. I stood there for a moment, stunned. This was exactly what I'd warned them about. Block the creek and the water would find another path. And now it looked like that path was headed straight for her house. I should have felt worried. But instead, I felt something else creeping in, a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. She had gone out of her way to destroy something that wasn't hers, and now nature itself was turning the tables. And it wasn't even close to done yet. The air felt heavier, almost electric. The storm was coming. And not just in the clouds gathering over the neighborhood. By the next morning, the sky had opened up. Rain fell in sheets, pounding against the rooftops and gushing down the gutters. The kind of rain that turns small puddles into small lakes in just a few hours. I stood at my kitchen window watching as the drops streaked the glass, and I couldn't help but think about that cement-filled creek. Water doesn't care about HOA rules. It doesn't care about property lines. It just goes where it wants. And right now it had nowhere to go but sideways. By mid-morning, I threw on my rain jacket and stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was the sound. My creek used to sing when it rained, rushing water, a soft roar that was oddly comforting. Now it was silent. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, almost menacing, broken only by the steady splash of rain hitting pooling water. I walked to the back of the property, my boots sinking deeper into the soggy ground with each step. The area where the creek used to flow was now just a long gray wall of cement, glistening with a slick sheen of rainwater. Above it, small streams of runoff trickled down the banks, looking for an escape. None of them found one. Instead, the water collected against the barrier, swelling higher and higher until it spilled over into the grass. The overflow wasn't just staying in my yard. I followed the water as it spread, winding its way toward the neighboring lots. It didn't take long to see where it was all heading, straight toward her property. Her yard was a mess. The grass near the back was submerged in several inches of water, rippling with each raindrop. I could see small whirlpools forming where the water rushed toward low spots. And the lowest spot of all? The slope that led directly to her basement windows. I moved closer, pretending to just be checking on things, though inside I was watching every detail. The water was pouring down the slope like a miniature river. It had already filled both of her window wells, and from where I stood, I could see it pressing against the glass. Rainwater, soil runoff, and whatever else it picked up along the way, it was all funneling right toward her foundation. A loud crack split through the air, not from the sky but from her property. One of the basement windows flexed under the pressure. Then, with a sudden burst, water shot into the opening like someone had turned on a fire hose. It was instant chaos. The current dragged leaves, twigs, and dirt into the house. I could only imagine the sound it was making inside. Furniture scraping across the floor, the splash of rising water, the panicked shouts of anyone down there. I didn't move. I just stood in the rain, hood pulled low, watching as her perfect HOA-approved lawn turned into a flood zone. The water was relentless, swirling faster now, churning with mud. Her downspouts were useless. The gutters overflowed, adding even more to the problem. Minutes turned into hours and the rain never let up. I could see her pacing in her kitchen window, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly. No doubt she was calling anyone she could plumbers, contractors, maybe even the HOA board. But there was nothing quick enough to stop what was already happening. The smell hit next. Damp earth, wet cement, and that faint, musty odor of waterlogged wood. Her basement lights flickered once, twice, and then went dark. She disappeared from the window. I pictured her wading through ankle-deep water, trying to save whatever she could before it was too late. But the water didn't care about her rush. It crept higher, covering the bottom half of the walls, swallowing cardboard boxes and storage bins, pushing small items into strange corners. And through it all, there was movement beneath the surface. Fish. Actual fish. The same kind that used to swim in my creek. They darted through the murky water as if they belonged there, weaving around submerged furniture like it was part of a new reef. Somehow, life had found a way in the middle of her disaster. I stepped back, water sloshing around my boots, the rain still drumming overhead. The creek might have been silenced, but its revenge was loud and clear. Nature doesn't forget and it doesn't forgive, not when you pour cement where water should run. And now, the very thing she tried to erase was flowing stronger than ever, right where she least wanted it to be. By the time the rain slowed to a drizzle, her backyard looked like something out of a disaster movie. The once neat rows of hedges were half submerged, the grass rippled like the surface of a pond, and her prized flower beds had vanished under a layer of muddy water. The cement-filled creek was now just a solid wall holding back a massive pool that had no natural exit, and it was only a matter of time before gravity took over and pushed it all toward the lowest point, her basement. From where I stood, I could hear the hum of a pump coming from inside her house, the kind contractors used to try to get water out fast. It was a constant, desperate sound, but every time I glanced at the slope, the water level didn't seem to be going down. If anything, it was creeping higher. I watched as the pump's hose snaked out a side window, spilling water into the driveway, only for it to run right back toward the yard and join the flood again. I noticed movement in the distance. 2 men in bright rain jackets sloshing through the water toward the basement access door. One of them carried a toolbox, the other a long crowbar. They worked in frantic bursts, prying open window frames, pulling debris from the openings, and shouting instructions over the sound of rushing water. Their boots disappeared halfway up their shins with every step. Then came the unmistakable voice. Even over the chaos, I heard her barking orders. She was standing on the deck, clutching her phone in one hand and waving the other like she was directing traffic. Every few seconds she would point toward my yard, toward the cement wall she'd ordered poured, as if trying to blame the problem on me. Her hair was plastered to her head, rain dripping from her nose, but that usual fire in her eyes was still there, only this time it was fueled by panic. She disappeared inside for a while, and when she returned she was dragging out armfuls of belongings. Plastic tubs, cardboard boxes, bags of clothes, anything she could carry. She piled them in the middle of the deck, out of reach of the water, her steps fast and unsteady. Every so often she'd glance at the basement door, where more water was spilling out in muddy waves. The strange part was the fish were still there. Every time I caught sight of the basement through a broken window, I could see them darting through the murky water like silver streaks. Some swam lazily near the surface. Others zipped around corners as if exploring their new home. It was surreal, a flooded basement that had somehow become an aquarium. At one point, one of the workers climbed up from the basement and shook his head at her. I couldn't hear the exact words over the rain, but his expression said it all. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. This wasn't something you just mop up and move on from. The water kept finding new ways in. The soil around her foundation had softened so much that small rivulets were cutting paths straight toward the walls. It didn't matter how many sandbags they stacked, the water simply flowed around them. The storm drains in the street were overwhelmed too, leaving the road glistening with a thin sheet of runoff that glided right back down toward her house. She kept looking in my direction as if expecting me to step in to offer help. But what could I really say? I had warned her. More than once. I had told her exactly what would happen if she blocked the creek. And now, standing there with water creeping into every corner of her basement, she was living the very scenario she had dismissed. I stayed silent. Just watched as the daylight faded, the deck lights clicked on, and her backyard took on an eerie glow under the floodwater. The reflection of the house shimmered on the surface, broken occasionally by the splash of a fish or the ripple of the pump hose shifting in the current. Every so often, another crack would echo from somewhere inside, the sound of wet wood giving way or furniture toppling over. I could imagine the soggy carpet squelching underfoot, the smell of damp drywall setting in, the slow spread of damage that would take weeks, maybe months, to fix. And still, the cement wall in my yard stood firm, holding back the natural flow of water that should have been moving freely. The same wall she thought would solve her problem had instead built a reservoir that Mother Nature was now emptying directly into her life. The creek wasn't gone, it had simply changed its course. And in doing so, it had claimed her home as part of its path. The rain had stopped, but the damage was only just beginning to show itself in full. By the next morning, the air carried that damp, heavy smell that lingers after a flood. It wasn't just mud and wet grass, it was soaked drywall, soggy insulation, and the unmistakable must of water that had been trapped where it didn't belong. From my kitchen window, I could see her backyard glistening under the pale sunlight. Patches of grass were still underwater, and the slope toward her basement looked like it had been clawed apart by tiny rivers during the storm. I walked outside slowly, coffee in hand, surveying the aftermath. My creek, or what used to be my creek, was still blocked off by that solid wall of cement. Behind it, the ground was saturated like a sponge that had absorbed more than it could hold. Water seeped out in thin streams along the edges, feeding a network of muddy trails that cut across my lawn. And as I followed those trails, I noticed they all pointed in one direction, toward her property. Down at the back of her lot, the real mess was clear. The basement windows were open now, probably to try and air the place out. But instead of fresh air, the smell of wet wood and mildew drifted into the neighborhood. From where I stood, I could see dark stains climbing halfway up her basement walls. The window wells, once shiny metal, were caked in mud and algae. The pump hose was still stretched out into the yard, though the sound of it running was much weaker than yesterday. 2 men were trudging in and out of the basement carrying ruined furniture, soaked chairs, a swollen bookshelf, and what looked like the remains of a desk that had come apart at the joints. They dumped everything in a growing pile near the driveway. Cardboard boxes had collapsed into sagging lumps. Clothes, books, and papers were scattered across the heap, sticking together in a soggy mess. Each time the men came up the stairs, they stepped into the mud and sank nearly to their ankles. And then I saw her. Standing at the edge of the driveway, hands on her hips, eyes fixed on the mess as if she could will it all back to the way it was. She didn't see me, at least not yet, but the tension in her shoulders told me everything. She wasn't just frustrated. She was angry. Maybe at the rain, maybe at the water, maybe even at herself. But I knew deep down she would find a way to point that finger at me. Sure enough, a little while later she walked over. Her hair was tied back, but loose strands stuck to her cheeks, and her shoes were caked in mud. "This is because of your creek," she started, her voice sharp. "My creek," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. "You mean the one you filled with cement?" She blinked, her mouth opening for a retort but no words coming out. I could see the conflict flickering behind her eyes. Part of her wanted to double down, but another part knew she'd been warned. More than once. I didn't bother arguing. I just gestured toward the slope between our properties. That water had to go somewhere. You made sure it couldn't go where it's supposed to. She huffed, muttered something under her breath and turned back toward her house. But the truth was already sitting heavy between us. This wasn't just bad luck. It was cause and effect. By mid-afternoon, more people had gathered. Neighbors from down the street wandered over, shaking their heads, murmuring about how bad it smelled, how fast the flood came. A few even glanced at the cement wall in my yard with raised eyebrows. They knew. Maybe they didn't say it out loud, but the story was writing itself in their minds. One of the older neighbors, a retired man named Frank, stood beside me for a while, sipping his tea. "I've lived here 30 years, he said quietly. "That creek's never caused trouble. But you block a natural water path, you're asking for it." His words hung in the air like a quiet verdict. As the sun dipped lower, the activity in her yard slowed. The workers left, the pile of ruined belongings sat abandoned in the driveway, and her house looked smaller somehow. Like the flood had taken some of its life with it. The only sounds were the occasional drip of water from the eaves and the squelch of my boots in the mud as I turned to walk back home. I passed the cement wall again, running my hand lightly over its rough, cold surface. It felt out of place here, like it didn't belong to the land. The creek's absence was still strange, still wrong, but in a way it was also still here. Not flowing in the open like before, but moving quietly beneath the surface, reshaping the ground in ways no one could stop. And in the stillness after the storm, I realized something. The water had all the time in the world. It would find its way no matter how much concrete you poured in its path. And when it did, it would remember exactly who tried to silence it. Days turned into weeks, but the smell never left her property. It clung to the air like a reminder of what had happened, damp, earthy, and sour. Every time I walked past her driveway, the pile of ruined belongings seemed to grow. Some of it had been dragged closer to the curb for pickup, but most of it still sat there in an unorganized heap. Broken furniture leaned against splintered boards. Cardboard boxes sagged open, spilling out water-stained papers and faded photographs. It was as if her basement had vomited up its past for the whole neighborhood to see. She tried to keep her head high at first. I'd see her out front, talking to whoever would listen, weaving her own version of events. According to her, this was all just a freak storm, something no one could have predicted. But the neighbors weren't buying it. People around here have lived through bigger storms without a single basement flooding. And the fact that her disaster happened right after she filled my creek with cement? That wasn't a coincidence anyone could ignore. Word spread quietly as it always does. At first, it was whispered conversations at mailboxes and over fences. Then it became casual comments in the grocery store parking lot. Everyone had their own opinion, but most of them ended the same way: she brought this on herself. I never joined in those conversations. I didn't have to. The truth didn't need my voice to be heard. Meanwhile, the creek was still finding its way. The ground behind the cement wall stayed soft and spongy, even on dry days. Little trickles of water cut thin channels through the mud, slowly carving new paths. I noticed small pools forming in the shade of the trees, their surfaces rippling with movement. One afternoon, I spotted minnows flashing silver beneath the surface, darting around fallen leaves. The life that had once thrived in my creek wasn't gone, it was adapting. Her basement, on the other hand, wasn't adapting to anything. Contractors came and went, hauling in dehumidifiers and fans, tearing out sections of soaked drywall. I heard the constant hum of equipment whenever I walked by. But each time I caught a glimpse inside, it still looked like a war zone. The concrete floor was bare, the walls stripped to the studs, and puddles lingered in corners no matter how much they pumped. I kept my distance, but sometimes she'd catch sight of me. Our eyes would meet for a second, hers sharp, mine steady. No words. Just that unspoken understanding of cause and effect. She knew I knew. And she knew there was nothing she could say to make me the villain in this story. The HOA was quieter than usual. No notices in my mailbox, no letters about maintenance violations. Even the regular patrols seemed to slow down. I think they realized they'd crossed a line that couldn't be defended. Or maybe they were just too busy dealing with the fallout of her situation. After all, a flooded basement in the HOA president's own home doesn't exactly scream competence. The rains came again a few weeks later, not as heavy as before but steady enough to test the ground. I stood at my back porch and watched as water once again pooled behind the cement wall. It didn't take long before the overflow began its familiar journey toward her yard. By then, her basement repairs were barely halfway done. I didn't need to see inside to know the panic that must have been setting in. That night, I dreamed of the creek. Not as it was before, but as it might be in the future. Still hidden, still quiet, but carrying its strength beneath the surface. It was patient. It was stubborn. It didn't care about property lines, HOA rules, or anyone's idea of tidy landscaping. It only knew how to move forward, to find a way, no matter how many obstacles were placed in its path. When I woke, the world outside was damp and gray. The air smelled fresh again, but the ground told a different story. I walked to the back fence, tracing the water's path with my eyes. It flowed exactly where it wanted, unbothered by the cement wall, unbothered by the mess it left behind. And as I stood there watching nature take back what was hers, I couldn't help but feel that quiet, undeniable truth settle over me again. You can't fight the water. Not forever. It always finds its way home.